exposition, by the way, is titled Post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan Between Nationalism and Nation States. Vincent himself received his BA and MA in Geography, as well as a certificate in Russian and East European Studies at the University of Oregon. He was awarded the David Sofer New Scholar Award for his paper, Neglected Geographies, Islam in Soviet Central Asia. In 2012, he received the AAG Graduate Student Paper Award in Honorable Mention, as well as Geographer's Political Geography Specialty Group Student Paper Award for his paper, Geopolitics, Islam and Terror, Representation in Uzbek-American Relations. He also, just recently, was told that he was awarded the Summer 2013 Chris Spenso Graduate Research Assistantship to conduct field research in Kyrgyzstan.
Hopefully I'll be able to make it. All right, well, thank you, Bart, and thank you for everyone for coming here today. I know it's a nice day out here and it's a little bit stuffy in here, but I'd like to take this opportunity to, again, thank everyone for coming. And I am, as Bart mentioned, going to be presenting my Laird essay. There's a pigeon outside who looks really curious about what's happening in here. Stick around. But my paper, as Bart mentioned, is called Post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan Between Nationalism and Nation State. And Kyrgyzstan is actually something that I've come to fairly recently. I've been interested in Central Asia for a few years now, but my earlier research was mostly focused on Uzbekistan. But one of my major interests is Islam, which I'm going to talk about very briefly in this talk. But I feel like Kyrgyzstan is sometimes neglected a little bit when we talk about religion in Central Asia, largely because a lot of the focus is actually on Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and to a lesser extent Kazakhstan. And I've actually had a long-standing interest in issues of nationalism, and took many courses on that from Professor Syovkin and other professors also at the University of Oregon. So, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, how many talks start off with those words? But since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kyrgyzstan has been a state that has been really trying very hard to formulate a sense of national identity. It's not a very homogeneous state. The northern part of the country is heavily ethnic Kyrgyz, with a large, though diminishing, Russian population. And the southern part of the country is heavily Uzbek, with a few Tajik enclaves as well. And different governments, ever since 1992, have tried a number of different strategies to try to build a coherent sense of national identity in this country. And I would argue that as of today, none of them have succeeded very, very well. Here we just have some sort of generic Kyrgyz out by a yurt wearing a typical Kyrgyz kalpak, flavor picture. But to really understand what's happening in Kyrgyzstan today, we actually have to go back in time to the Soviet period, and we need to talk a little bit about kolonizatsiya and the delimitation of borders in Soviet Central Asia. As I'm sure many people in this room know, the so-called Kyrgyz and Uzbek national identities as such did not exist prior to the Soviet period. Nationalism itself is a European ideology, and many of the sort of senses of identity that people had were either based on lifeways. Were they nomadic? Were they sedentary? Did they live in cities? Did they live in yurts out on the steppe? And Uzbek and Kyrgyz were not necessarily categories that people thought of themselves in prior to the invention of traditions, to sort of grab a phrase from Eric Hobsbawm. During the Soviet period, different groups were given different languages, or particular dialects were sort of reified as national languages. Different groups were given different histories. They had their own literary and musical traditions, and the point was to differentiate them as much from their neighbors as possible. And some have argued that this was a deliberate attempt to divide the large Muslim Turkic population of Central Asia and the Middle Volga into smaller units that could be ruled more easily from Moscow. The problem is, when they were dividing them into these constituent republics, it was really hard for them to draw borders that actually conformed very well to the real distribution of people on the ground. Because populations are distributed very unevenly. Nobody can draw a border that completely surrounds a particular population, unless you're in Iceland or something like that. But particularly in Central Asia, it's virtually impossible. And so you end up with lots of enclaves, either part of one republic that is within the borders of another republic, or as in Kyrgyzstan, you have many populations of Uzbeks, for instance, who actually just live in Kyrgyzstan in places like Osh and Jalalabad and so forth. And the lines that were drawn during the Soviet period more or less persist to this day as independent nation states which are pursuing their own frequently conflicting national sort of projects. Uzbekistan wants water, but Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan control that water, and there are looming issues about that. More to the point for this lecture, a lot of these enclaves that were built into the structure of the Fergana Valley, for instance, still exist. So this yellow is all Kyrgyzstan, and you can see, Uzbekistan, and you can see throughout parts of Kyrgyzstan there are small enclaves that are actually Uzbek territory, but they're completely surrounded by Kyrgyzstan. Also, and it's sort of hard to see on here, but this sort of green blob here is more or less the distribution of ethnic Uzbeks. And you can see that they sort of span several different countries here. Again, this border was drawn in such a way that ethnic Uzbeks ended up in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and in many cities such as Osh, which is a historically Uzbek city. It's just part of Kyrgyzstan today, and it's actually the second largest city in the Kyrgyz Republic. So, as I mentioned, you have a lot of diversity. Today, Kyrgyz make up 71% of the population of the Kyrgyz Republic, but that wasn't always the case. In 1989, there were only about 50%. Uzbeks have remained about 14%, although in terms of their raw numbers, their population has actually doubled, or more or less doubled, since 1970. And Russians and others, which would be Germans and other Europeans, have decreased quite significantly. As you can see, Russians were at, in 1989, almost 21% of the population. Now they're down to 8%, and they're still sort of trickling out. So you have a very strong Kyrgyz majority, and it's growing. You also have what David Lighting has called beached diasporas. Russians are the ones that this word was, or this phrase was coined for, but I think you can also think of Uzbeks as people who are sort of stranded outside of their own republic now, and oftentimes their interests and their views are not taken into account. But again, we have a growing Uzbek minority. Their population continues to increase. Along with the borders, ethnic particularisms, this sense that Uzbeks are not the same as Kyrgyz, that Tajiks are not the same as the rest of them, all of this does not disappear either, and numerous authors have called this Stalin's ethnic time bomb and that sort of thing in different contexts. So before the collapse of the Soviet Union, even in 1990, there was a really bitter round of ethnic violence in the city of Osh, down there in the southern part of Kyrgyzstan. As you remember, I said that's an Uzbek majority city, but by the end of the Soviet period, many ethnic Kyrgyz were starting to flow in from more rural areas into the cities. And they were, in this particular case, there was a lot of pressure on the Soviet government, or the local government perhaps, to take some land away from a kolkhoz that had been farmed mainly by ethnic Uzbeks, and build apartment complexes there. And there was basically two competing protests on either side of this. It eventually erupted into violence, and depending on whose numbers you believe, between 300 and 1,000 people were killed in this round of violence. And again, this has repeated itself just a couple of years ago. Some border problems surrounding these enclaves that I mentioned earlier broke out around Jalalabad, and they spread to Osh as well. During this period, you had a growing sense of Uzbek nationalism. They were beginning to feel that their views, quite rightly, were not being taken into account. And at the same time, again, you had more and more Kyrgyz flowing into the cities and trying to find housing, trying to find land, and feeling that many of the Uzbeks were dominating the markets and they were dominating some of the best jobs. After the fall of Bakiev, again, these border problems and some other things erupted, and you end up with about 430 people dead in Osh in 2010. And both of these have left massive scars between these two populations. So it's not really that hard to understand why Almazbek Atambayev, the current president of Kyrgyzstan, would argue that nationalism is, quote, the main problem in Kyrgyzstan today. And when he was, in 2012, addressing a joint audience of Uzbeks and Kyrgyz in the city of Osh, he argued that only together are we Kyrgyzstan. Those who try to divide us according to nationality and region are enemies of the state. But just because he says this doesn't mean that those problems are going to go away, and as we'll see in the rest of this presentation, successive Kyrgyz governments have really not had much success in articulating this sort of togetherness identity, this civic Kyrgyzstani identity that Kyrgyzstan probably needs to hold together. This long quote here from Alec Murphy, basically the gist of it is that one of the ways that a national group finds its own identity is through identification with a particular territory. So the Kyrgyz, you see this in the writings of Askar Akayev, the first president of Kyrgyzstan. He really locates Kyrgyz identity as being rooted in the actual territory of Kyrgyzstan itself. But in multicultural societies, this is very problematic because Kyrgyz aren't the only ones who live in Kyrgyzstan, and so you're sort of excluding Russians, and you're excluding Uyghurs, and you're excluding Uzbeks, and you're excluding anyone else who lives in this country because you're saying this land is ours and it's identified with us. Another problem, as Eugene Husky has pointed out, is that the Kyrgyz themselves, because they were a nomadic people, they don't have much of a written history until the Soviets came along, and a lot of the history that the Soviets wrote for them is something they want to keep at arm's length in some cases. They have a dearth of usable national history from which to build sort of a national identity. There's certainly no sort of Kyrgyzstani civic identity that can, again, draw different competing groups together. One attempt that Askar Akayev tried to elaborate in the 1990s was focused around the Manas Epos, which is a 500,000-line epic poem that details the exploits of this guy, Manas, who's on, you can see, I couldn't find a very good picture, but this thing that he's on, this column, is really high. And it's a gigantic statue. He's on the coins. He's associated with the tundik, which is a Kyrgyz sort of national symbol. And this Manas Epos details his sort of heroic exploits thousands of years ago, gallivanting around in what's now Kyrgyzstan, defeating enemies and doing all these kinds of things. They've called it the longest epic poem in history based on particular criteria. And the focus on this is, they've actually tried to get UNESCO to give this some sort of cultural heritage protection. And the whole point is to try to root Kyrgyz identity in something solid. You've got this book, you've got this guy, we can root the identity. And in a lot of ways, this was sort of an attempt to find an analog to Tamerlane, who the Uzbeks have sort of evoked as their own national hero, or Genghis Khan, who the Kazakhs have sort of called their own national hero, and they're trying to make Manas into sort of the Kyrgyz national hero. The problem is it doesn't really work all that well. Again, Askar Akayev, this smiling figure, I don't think I've ever seen a picture of him where he's not grinning like this. He was one of the main advocates of this ideology. And you can see that he ties Kyrgyz identity not only to Manas, but to sort of their larger history. So aspirations for statehood, the actual state of Kyrgyzstan. And the great spirit of Manas were always with the Kyrgyz during their centuries-old history. Okay, but again, this is fairly exclusive. If you're trying to make Manas into a Kyrgyz hero, then he's not going to be an Uzbek hero. He's not going to be a Kazakh hero, or a Russian hero, or an Uyghur hero. He's a Kyrgyz hero. So along with some of the other symbols of Kyrgyz national identity, like the flag. This is a tindik. Again, that is supposed, that's the top of a yurt where you would open the yurt up and smoke would go out. That's a very nomadic symbol. Uzbeks don't really have that. They were sedentary farmers who didn't live in yurts. The sun around here with the 40 rays represents the 40 tribes of the Kyrgyz people. Uzbeks and Uyghurs and Russians are not one of the 40 tribes of the Kyrgyz people. So you have all of these different symbols that are promulgated by the early Kyrgyz state that really kind of discursively kick everyone else out. Akayev actually has actually been quoted as calling Uzbeks Southern Kyrgyz. Again, saying, and he said, oh, well, they have the best interests of their motherland at heart, or something like this. That might come as a rude surprise to Uzbeks who think of themselves as not Kyrgyz. After Akayev is thrown out for corruption and numerous other things in the so-called Tulip Revolution, this guy, Bakiev, comes to power. And unlike Akayev, his power base is actually down in the south among ethnic Kyrgyz. This allows him in many ways to sort of ignore the interests of ethnic Uzbeks and others. And despite coming to power with promises of being, anti-authoritarian and promoting parliamentarianism and all that sort of thing, he rather quickly gets mired in corruption, nepotism, authoritarianism. The economy falls apart, and ethnic favoritism that really favors ethnic Kyrgyz quickly gets promoted. Whenever ethnic Uzbeks or other minorities try to sort of protest, he gets his brother, Janish Bakiev, who's the head of the security services, to basically make their problems go away in one way or another. Because of this collapsing economy, moreover, the economic nationalism that I sort of mentioned earlier becomes even more acute, and you have, again, ethnic Kyrgyz who are starting to feel like those Uzbeks are sort of running all of the bazaars, and they're running all of the economy, and we should get our piece as well. So after Bakiev himself gets thrown out in another revolution in 2010, a lot of these problems come to a head. Again, in June of 2010, the city of Osh in particular is devastated by these riots between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz, leaving hundreds, mostly Uzbeks, dead. Since that time, this fellow here, Milis Mirzakhmatov, he's the mayor of Osh, and he is very much a strident Kyrgyz chauvinist. He prefers to take a very Kyrgyz first policy in Osh, and you actually see a lot of Uzbeks kind of picking up and leaving after these riots because they can't find jobs. They're going to Russia and other places. And he doesn't really care about their interest whatsoever. And according to the International Crisis Group, Uzbeks in Osh are, quote, increasingly withdrawing into themselves. At the time, the interim president, Rosa Otunbayeva, kind of tried to clamp down on some of this stuff, but this guy basically told her to come do something about it if she wanted to. And it became very, very clear very quickly that the Otunbayeva government and even the Atambayev government that's currently in power really have very little control in the south. As far as I know, that guy's still in power. I might be wrong about that, but I think he's still sort of running the show in Osh. And Atambayev's government, as the ICG notes, the senior members of his government expressed dismay that tensions in the south, in part because of this guy, are increasing, but they really have no particular way of influencing the situation there through policy. So what's next? Kyrgyzstan in a lot of ways is back where it started in 1992. This sort of civic manas ideology failed. Uzbeks didn't really buy into it, despite the fact that Akayev's re-election campaign slogan was "Kyrgyzstan is our common home." They didn't really buy into it. There certainly are some people, ethnic Kyrgyz, who do kind of see this manas ideology as being very important, but I just don't see it really becoming something that is truly sort of pan-Kyrgyzstani. The Osh riots proved that encouraging ethnic antagonisms between these two different groups and basically promoting the Kyrgyz doesn't really promote social stability or state cohesion, and in some ways it's actually made this north-south divide even worse. And again, the central government really doesn't have an awful lot of control down in the south. So it seems that we're at sort of an impasse. Here you can just see this very clear in the 2011 presidential election. Atambayev, the current president, gets the north, and the south is split between a number of his opponents who are both essentially Kyrgyz chauvinists who really don't care an awful lot about the Uzbeks, and the Uzbeks in many ways just kind of stayed home. They didn't participate too much in this election. So what I'm kind of looking at in some of my research and hopefully in my dissertation is the idea that religion may be starting to be used by the Kyrgyz government as an ideology of unity. 80% of the population of Kyrgyzstan, at least nominally, identifies as Muslim, although many of them are quite secular in their outlook. The other 11%, 11% is Orthodox Christian, and the rest is sort of split between various either sort of shamanistic religions or increasingly Western sort of Protestant evangelical sects as well. Importantly, Islam, Sunni Islam, and Orthodox Christianity are recognized openly by the state as the quote-unquote traditional religions of Kyrgyzstan, and other ones are finding it harder and harder to sort of operate freely because of a law that was passed in 2009 that gives the state significant control over what's happening religiously. Just recently actually, 2012, 2 years after the fighting and the riots in Osh, a new mosque was opened on Suleiman's Mountain, which is one of the most holy places in all of Central Asia for Muslims. And Atambayev was there, and he said the Muslims of Osh should become a uniting force for all city dwellers. Both his words and the fact that they chose to open this mosque on the anniversary of these riots, I think, symbolically positioned Islam in opposition to ethnic particularisms and ethnic violence. So here, you can't really see it that well, but here's the mosque. That car down there kind of gives you a sense of the scale of this thing. It's a pretty big mosque. I've read that it's supposed to be the biggest mosque in Central Asia. I'm not sure. I think there might be one in Kazakhstan that's bigger, but in any case, it's pretty large. In addition to sort of symbolically positioning Islam as something that is opposed to nationalism, the state has also continued to institutionalize its control over religion. So there are debates over whether religious education should be taken over by the state. There are debates over whether imams or Muslim clergy should be employees of the state to make sure that they're saying the right things and not spreading, poorly informed lies about Islam. There are debates about whether veiling is okay, even though it's increasing very much. Religious freedoms, again, in 2009 have been severely curtailed since then. Religious literature is increasingly under control of the state. This law was promulgated in part to combat so-called extremism and fundamentalism, although, as I'll show in a minute, this has some side effects as well. And it's also meant to kind of curtail evangelical proselytism in Kyrgyzstan as well. Again, Orthodoxy and Islam are the traditional religions of Kyrgyzstan, and they don't necessarily want Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or other people coming in and kind of taking away some of that mind share. But there's some pitfalls with this as well. Kyrgyzstan, by its constitution, is an officially secular country, and because of 70 years of Soviet rule, a large percentage of the population is extremely secular. Even if they nominally say that they're Muslim, many of them are very resistant to giving religion a stronger role in politics. This is particularly the case up in the north, because again, the north is more cosmopolitan, and in the south you tend to have the more religiously conservative Uzbek population as well. That leads me to the second point. There's kind of an ethnic dimension to these charges of extremism. Uzbeks and Uyghurs are often represented in the media and in government statements as being particularly prone to quote-unquote fundamentalism. What that always means, or extremism, what these mean are oftentimes a little bit vague. But it kind of excludes them again. If the state is taking more control over religious practice by saying the way that these people do it is extreme or fundamentalist, you're kind of excluding them as from the discourse of acceptable religious practice. And I think one of the things that I'm thinking about is that institutionalizing religion in this country particularly really runs the risk of introducing new cleavages in a society that's already sort of pretty fractured. You're exacerbating the ethnic problems that you're trying to get rid of in the first place, and you're really kind of kicking the hornet's nest of secularism as well. So the future prospects here are pretty unclear. There hasn't been an awful lot of research done on this. In the Western press, very, very little has been written. There's some in the Russian language press, but not a whole lot, so I'm kind of hoping to fill that gap. But I think it's interesting because Kyrgyzstan is often sort of overshadowed, or at least the question of religion in Kyrgyzstan is overshadowed. There's certainly a focus on security, there's a focus on development, definitely because of all the revolutions, there's this focus on democratization. And oftentimes when we're talking about religion in Central Asia, we're talking again about Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or Kazakhstan, but a lot of times Kyrgyzstan is sort of left out of the picture. But I think it's an interesting case because I think it sheds light on the role of religion in post-Soviet, post-colonial, and post-secular nation-building strategies. So thank you. I'd like to thank Betty Laird for sort of establishing the opportunity for all of us, and me and all of the other Laird people in the past to come and give these lectures. I'd like to thank the committee. It's quite an honor to be speaking. I'd like to thank Kreese for, again, the opportunity to be here and for giving me a FIMSO over the summer. I'd like to thank my advisor, Alexander Diener, who's put up with more instances of me wandering into his office with some vague, harebrained idea about what I want to study. And my wife, Elisa Moldavanova, who likewise has put up with a lot of me grousing and being grumpy and questioning whether what I'm doing is even worthwhile. So if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them, and thank you very much.